I'm so excited to be opening the latest version of our intervention series. That is an exhibition that we have here at Mint Randolph where we invite contemporary artists who are usually of Mayan or Aztec descent, which are the pieces, or Inca, which are the pieces that we have upstairs in our galleries, our Mesoamerican galleries, to come and create work in response to those pieces. Now, as you will hear during this talk, our latest artist, Jackie Milad. Yay, Jackie! Woo! Jackie has a slightly different story and way of coming about this project. And it's more from an archival and from a... it's part of her project as an artist to go and investigate these archaeological objects and things that make up museum collections or tell us what these histories are of these supposedly lost civilizations, which in fact are civilizations that are actually active and growing and thriving and vibrant today. So Jackie is sort of, I mean, you're Honduran, but I always feel like I have to then explain like 18 things about what that means, but we'll talk about that in a minute too. So I'm just going to say today marks the celebration of Jackie Milad's installation, Buscando la Sirena, which is upstairs. If you haven't already seen it, and I grabbed a lot of you from those galleries, I know you have seen it. I'm so glad. But we are just so excited that Jackie was able to find the time in what has become a very busy installation schedule to do this project with the Mint Museum. So I guess, let's welcome her. Yay! Just to give you a little background on Jackie, she received her BFA from the School of the Museum of Fine Arts at Tufts University and her MFA from Towson University. She is currently represented here in Charlotte by Soko Gallery, which is over on Providence. She was a McCall resident in the summer of 2021. Hopefully, a lot of you got to meet her or see her work when she was there. She's had a number of residencies, which I think she'll talk about as we have our conversation. She also has an extraordinary installation that's up at the Baltimore Museum of Art, her hometown, where she was born and raised, that opened last spring, but it's up through this spring, so you can still go and see it. And we'll see images of it in the show, and it's just absolutely extraordinary. It's an installation with two other artists, Fred Wilson and Nikisha Durrett. And then she also just opened a show up in Maine. Oh my God, we just talked about this artist too, and I've completely...
Libby Paloma.
Yes, Libby Paloma.
Yeah.
Which is such an amazing name. I can't believe I just forgot it. So that show opened up in Maine and is up through February. Is that correct? I mean, if anyone's making their way up to Maine. So we're going to just start talking. We're going to talk for about half an hour. We're going to go through Jackie's origin story. We've been talking a lot about Marvel this weekend, so it seems appropriate to throw out origin story here for superhero. And then we're going to talk about her process, her projects, and then the work that she's been making recently. So, Jackie.
Hello.
Hello.
Am I good? Okay.
Okay.
Hello.
Great. I know I feel weird. So let's talk a bit about your origin story. So born and raised in Baltimore.
That's right.
Your parents are first generation.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to talk a bit about their background?
Sure, yeah. So my parents immigrated to the U.S. in the 70s. My dad is from Egypt, and my mother's from Honduras. And I grew up in Baltimore, still live in Baltimore City. And grew up with many languages. We were talking about that yesterday. English, Arabic, Spanish, French sometimes even. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And your dad speaks a lot of languages. And I actually wanted to talk a bit about, because your dad, we haven't actually talked about this before, and I'm not asking to go too personal here, but it's interesting to me the parallels between your father and your husband, Tom, in that
Oh.
they're both like
That's interesting.
they're both very, like, I think of people who can speak a lot of languages as also being inherently musical or intrinsically musical. And your father speaks a lot of languages, and Tom plays a lot of instruments.
Yeah,
So I
that's
wanted to talk a
interesting.
bit about, like, how that, because that also comes up in the work, which we'll talk about in a little bit.
Yeah.
But can you talk a bit about like your dad's languages and how that influenced your way of seeing the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's really a very interesting connection I never made. But it's true, and Tom speaks and takes up languages very easily, picks up languages. But I would say that, for me growing up in a household with that many languages, it's often, I felt like I didn't always know what was going on. I mean, I understand fluently Spanish, but I think it was very chaotic. I thought, at the time, very much like trying to catch up with like my brothers. Also, my half brothers are fully Honduran, and they immigrated to the U.S., so they were speaking Spanish fluently. My cousin. Arabic was, so it was a very, like there's a lot of information, as you can imagine, getting all those kinds of languages at the same time. In fact, growing up, going to elementary school, for example, we were talking about that yesterday, they didn't understand, the teachers were like, well, you're speaking different languages all at the same time, that maybe you need to focus on just one language. And I think the belief is very different now, but like at the time in the early 80s, it was a very confusing idea there.
And your father came to your defense there and
Yeah.
said, in fact,
No, she speaks multiple languages. Lay off.
let her be a
Let her-
genius.
Yeah.
Just because you can't keep up doesn't mean.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that upbringing definitely influenced what's going on in terms of a lot of information, the symbols that I use. I'm incorporating Spanish, incorporating Arabic, English. It's like oversaturation of information. The layering of all of those sounds and symbols, that's just totally a reflection of my upbringing, I think.
Yeah, and having the works up here, and these are recent works from this installation, but you can see there are recognizable figurative objects in there, but there are also a lot of abstractions and symbols and lines and dots and things like that. And it made me think about the fact that, we were talking about your cousin who spoke Arabic and you who spoke Spanish, and the fact that you grew up like siblings, and yet all the adults marveled that you guys communicated with each other, even though you were speaking completely different languages.
Yeah.
And the idea that leads to some sort of, not only sort of intimate or intrinsic understanding, but also this comfortable relationship to abstraction as communication. So like the sounds that you're hearing are abstracted because the meaning's been removed, and yet you could comfortably exist in that space. And so were you always comfortable vacillating between like abstraction and figuration, and the fact that you had all these languages that you didn't always understand? Do you think that had something to do with that kind of fluidity?
Yeah, that's yes. I mean, I think that language for me, of course we all associate understanding language with belonging, and so if you don't speak the language, you're not, this enough Honduran, or you're not Egyptian enough, and sort of but the in between of creating your own language, I mean, my cousin and I were basically doing that, right? Like creating our own kind of gestural language as children, and being okay with not knowing all the answers or not knowing exactly just being okay with being confused or interpret your own interpretation or I think that is 100%, in the work. I mean, I'm giving I'm giving people looking at the work so much information. It's an overstimulated painted surface, collage surface, that at times it feels like you can't enter the work, or it's confusing, or or maybe there's another experience that you have where you recognize symbols or you recognize the language, and then you have a kinship to that, like a connection. So I love that there could be these two different experiences with figuration versus abstraction, being comfortable with the unknown or not understanding, like all that.
Yeah, because there's so many codes within it, whether it's the objects that you're pulling from these different cultures and including in there, like they have symbolic meaning, or the languages you said, you have Arabic, you have English, you have Spanish in there, whether or not we can, I can understand the Spanish, but the Arabic, of course, like I can't, and then...
And then also context. You don't know, yeah, I mean, so you're like, well, what is that in reference to, or...
So do you use these incredibly vibrant colors as a way to kind of bring people in or entice people in to then get them feeling like they can investigate the work more, and even, they can pick out things they understand and not necessarily be intimidated if they don't get the rest? Because collage is intimidating. It feels like we can all do it, but it's also kind of intimidating for people to investigate or spend time with, I've found.
Yeah, the color, I would say that the color there's a part of it that's very attractive, but with the sort of bright colors, the hot pink and the bright green, there's it's like a sort of attraction, that like
artificiality of it is supposed to repulse us and feel very like, chemically.
Yeah. But the really for me the most important thing is that it causes chaos. That there's a sort of energy with the colors, or this feeling of vibration. Even. Putting colors together. I mean, I love color. I think it's pretty obvious. But as I have been working in these colors, I have started to see connections with my own family too. I told you about my grandmother. I was looking through pictures of her home and thinking about my experience of my grandmother in Honduras. And she painted, this is crazy, but she painted every room a different color. I think she was just this artist that didn't really like follow through in the same kind of way that she was thinking about color in her home very similarly, I think, using the same palette, hot pinks and, the greens, the yellows. And so I started to realize that information was like in me, and I was using some of that, referencing some of her colors also. So yeah, I mean, it's a very typical, this like salmon colors of the Central America, the blues and aquamarine.
And I love that idea of your grandmother working in the color and the palette and like painting her space.
Yeah.
In a parallel way, you're referencing her life through the fishing nets and the fish and the mangrove roots and all of the references to fishing in the Gulf of Fonseca, where they are, and all of that being in the work, that
Yeah.
exchange, I find really lovely.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this work is very much exploring your mother and your grandmother's heritage in Honduras, but is it going to work? No. Okay, let me stand up and do it. You know what? Not me doing that. Okay. Best laid plans. Okay. So these are works that you did in 2021 when you were at McCall. And I wanted to show these because they reference what you were doing previously, which was really exploring your father's Egyptian heritage and a lot of those symbols, whether it's things we might be familiar with, which are, images that we relate to pharaohs and Egyptian art, but also the decoration, and you can see some of those geometric cutouts there. So can you talk a bit about your project and what you're drawing from the fringe, which is also like there's this heavy textile, fashion, clothing element to your work as well.
Yeah.
So can you talk a bit about where all of these different references are coming from and how they're finding their way here?
Yeah. So I'll start by saying that from a very early age, I have always been very fascinated by history, storytelling, history. My father, my family, just because immigrants, they come mostly with nothing, right? And accept the stories of our heritage and stories of, the grandparents or great-grandparents and that sort of thing. And so as a child growing up in this country, I was just very like so hungry for that information. And museums were a place that I felt helped with the gap in terms of seeing the objects. Like I spent a lot of time at the Met Museum, at the Baltimore Museum of Art, the Smithsonian, that's just down the street from Baltimore, the Walters Art Gallery. These are all museums that hold objects of Egyptian antiquity and also Mesoamerican collections. And I really wanted, I was just super this desirable, hungry for those objects to tell me more, right? Or that the museum would give me more information, which they just couldn't, because, museums are protecting these objects and they're not. It's not messy, and history is very messy, and history is very layered, and you go to a place like Egypt, of course, and literally the walls are layered with history. And I, as a child, wanting to understand myself or wanting to understand my family's past, I was for some reason hoping that museums would do that job for me, but they didn't.
We pitched that we could, right? Like,
yeah,
we kind
sure.
of say, come here and learn about these different cultures, and
yeah, and I think that museums are
doing
better for sure. But in that period of like the 80s and things, it wasn't as important, I guess. But so the layering and the messiness is really, really important to when I'm making this work, to create this like what I feel history is, that this it's messy, it's reinterpreted, it's so the ancient objects, that ancient Egyptian drawings, or the icons that you see in the work, even upstairs, are living objects. These are objects that exist at the British Museum, and some exist at the Met too, that I used in this group of work. But I thought, by kind of bringing them, gathering up some of these objects by drawing them and then printing them, or reinterpreting them into, or collaging them into the work, I was really referencing this another part of that layered history. It's incorporating it into my story in a way. I don't really want to go full on because we don't have time, but I think of it as like sort of a repatriation, like a process of like bringing them into my individual story.
Yeah, and I'm just skipping ahead to this slide because that drawing of the work, like you're not taking photographs necessarily or images that you're of the object directly that you're collaging in. You're drawing it, making your interpretation, and so there is this sort of like you're acquiring some kind of agency over the image, but also over the meaning when you redraw it. And that repatriation moment kind of happens when you're drawing it.
Yes. And I think if you've ever done still life drawing, for example, and you're really looking at an object, that there's a different kind of emotional relationship that you have because you're really looking, right? And this burial mask, for example, I spent hours with this burial mask, looking at it, drawing it. So it's a very different kind of relationship that you have, as opposed to seeing an object in the museum behind glass and the sort of, not being able to really engage and spend, ridiculous amount of time. I feel like at a museum, the guard would be like, time to move on. But I was able to spend all day with these objects. And same for my experience here. So it is a very emotional kind of practice, and one I wasn't expecting.
So when did that become part of your practice? I would like to throw in here that what's also unusual about Jackie's approach to this is that she was a curator as well, that she not only has worked as an artist displaying in galleries, she also has organized gallery shows. And so your relationship to objects, as art objects, as vessels of meaning, as artistic intent, like you have that relationship with them too. And so when did you start looking at museum collections as kind of a resource for what you would be making?
At McCall, actually, I started, so in 2021, I started by looking at the online collections of these major museums, and knew that somehow I wanted to, again, this sort of gathering of objects to create these tapestries, right? And there was something about that, and I had a studio assistant, and she was helping me with all these drawings, and I thought, well, the vastness, I want to sort of represent as many objects as possible, and so having her help me to draw these objects. So we were looking at a digital form. It wasn't getting to this thing that I wanted, which was like a connection. And so, but that was the beginning of that thinking.
And I remember when we talked at McCall, you were frustrated. And that's when we talked about doing this project here. Because I was like, well, I got tons of objects. You want to come look at some objects?
Yeah, exactly.
I got lots of stuff you can go look at in
I got
person.
very excited. Yeah.
Yeah, I had forgotten about that, that you were frustrated with the online elements.
Yeah, so I had, over the course, actually, at McCall again, I connected with an Egyptian Egyptologist. She's Egyptian Egyptologist, archaeologist. And we started this sort of email connection. And she told me a story about how she had So in Egypt, there is the Grand Egyptian Museum is being built, or maybe it's finished. No one knows. It's like 20 years in the making. But they built the Grand Egyptian Museum amongst a community of people, existing community of people. And she and her team went to talk to this community, how they felt about the museum. And, their response was like, well, that's for the tourists. That's not for us. And so, but she knew that would be the response. And so she went back to the museum and was able to bring objects to them, mostly objects that had faces and, more sort of anatomical. And brought those objects back to the same group of people. And the experience of being in proximity to these objects really had a very potent, like emotional effect on people. And so their experience completely changed. They were like, or their opinion completely changed, where they were like, this is our museum. That's our heritage, that's our history. And so, I think that her telling me that story, I was like, oh, well, I need to see these objects in person. I was like, I need that. So that really led me to that next iteration of my practice of being in contact and sort of this drawing them.
So did that happen to you? Did you have that feeling of?
Oh, 100%. I mean, I think that it's overwhelming, actually. Yeah.
Just because we're talking, I mean, you and I have talked about this, I've talked to many people about this, but the whole idea of repatriation of these objects to their countries, and the argument that many of us in the museum profession are having is, well, we can just make casts of these things and have the casts of the objects in our collection so people can see the work, and but then return the pieces to the original cultures where they should be. But you making this comment about the original object having something which is then the argument that's going back and forth. The original object has that special elusive, unique quality.
Contains the story. Yeah. Well, I think repatriation is very tricky. It's like we could have a whole thing, like a whole conference on that. Yeah. But I think for me on a very personal level, I'm, just this act feels really good for me and my relationship to that past, because part of the issue with, museums is that there's a limitation because you're caring for these objects. And there's a limitation on how people can interact with these antiquities. And there's a limitation on how you display these antiquities because, they have to rest, they have to not be in sunlight or light, or,
They have to be under latrines, right? So
right.
they don't get dusty, and we have to keep cleaning them.
Exactly. So it's a very... It's
distancing.
It's distancing, yeah.
Yeah.
But in a way for good reason, right?
Absolutely.
I think, this kind of project, I feel very lucky because I have a chance to kind of connect and hopefully make the story of these, bringing these objects into the work, kind of add complexity and messiness to it.
And tells those stories and brings in that self-conscious awareness to these objects and what they're supposed to do, what trying to do, what museums are trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, I keep a record, my own record, a database of the objects, where they're coming from, kind of like a history or provenance or archive,
Right.
so that I know where they exist in reality. Yeah, so it's a very important part of it.
So we want to also talk about, oh my gosh, I totally forgot that was here.
Yeah, this is important.
Let's talk about this and then we'll move on to the actual making of the object.
Okay.
So these are all, we've been talking a lot about the Egyptian, we've been talking in general about archaeological finds, but the Egyptian pieces define the work up until this project, and now you're looking at specifically the Gulf of Fonseca, where your mother's family is from. And these objects come from there.
Right. So so when we started, and I was looking at these, the objects in the collection here, I was also thinking, well, I just started something in my brain to understand more about the island in which my mom was born and raised. I just wanted to know more. It was as if this project was the catalyst for that research, because when we're talking about these objects, that are of indigenous origins. I wanted to know, well, what is the indigenous story of the island? And, I spoke to my mom and my uncle and, relatives, and they're like, well, the island, the story of the island is that it's, this port, kind of like a lot of the Spanish and the British just came to this port, and that was it. There was the story that the Spanish and the British told was that there were no indigenous people on this island before they landed, and that was in the 1500s or whatever. And that is a story that existed up until recently. Marie, another archaeologist that I reached out to, based in the Netherlands.
Oh, Netherlands.
Yeah, and her whole entire focus, and she has a blog that I Googled and her blog came up. And her entire focus, her research was on my mother's island, which seemed like so crazy to me, because it's like this very small island.
Very small.
It's very
small.
small.
No one would let me print the size of the island on the labels because no one believed me. But it's
Right.
only 29 miles wide, and yeah.
Yeah.
So now it's on the record, but I did find that numerous places.
And
But yeah, it's tiny.
It's tiny, and so Marie spent her time on the island, proving, doing these digs to prove that there were indigenous peoples on this island before the Europeans arrived. And so these are some of the objects that she found, carbon dated, previous to the Europeans arriving. And so these are some of the two, this head here, this effigy, and then that piece there, I have drawn. So it's a little bit of a different relationship. I didn't draw them in person. But I drew them and brought them into the work as a collage material that you'll see upstairs represented amongst the objects that I drew that are here in this collection. So I really wanted to kind of mix them into the story. And Marie, and all of these are living in a museum in Honduras. So that was a real kind of game changer for me.
And one of the things she's found out is that because it was also this way station for all of these indigenous tribes that were coming up through what is now South America into North America and vice versa, that instead of this being Mayan or Aztec kind of based or Incan based, it's a Lenca. They're Lenca,
right?
Which is a whole other different group, but also a very small indigenous group.
Yeah.
So that was fascinating.
Totally. Yeah.
But again, like the exchanges, because it's this very fluid trade that's going on. So you make these studies, and then you do the collages that bring the images and the color and the different abstract shapes that often have, like all abstraction, have some sort of basis in reality or everyday objects.
Yeah.
It's not everyday objects.
But
Objects. Just objects.
Yeah.
Not qualifying. So
Yeah.
I wanted
Yeah.
you to talk a bit about, because you dye your canvases.
Yeah.
And I find that very, not only important because it's a lot of work, but also surprising because then you completely cover them.
Yeah.
So this is clearly something you're compelled to do.
I don't.
For
It's
your reasons. So let's talk about going from the support to the surface, and you can see that transition here.
Yeah, I do dye. I use an acid dye for these, but I have started doing more natural dyeing as well. Yeah, it's I think that for me, I'm not someone that has ever enjoyed stretching a canvas. Like, I can't do. I'm not into it.
Yeah.
Have for a very long time worked on paper, and so the previous slide that you have, that was like when I'm kind of working through ideas, it's always on paper and collaging. It's a very quick kind of experience. But I found that the canvas, if I'm not stretching it and I do dye the canvas, and it has a sort of paper quality to it that it kind of transcends a lot of things. So it goes into other things too, like tapestry. It can be seen as textile, like it could be patterning of a textile. So there's some flexibility in terms of, not just in terms of formally, but also just practical purposes too. I can be rougher with the canvas. I can sew into it. I can do all kinds of things. It's exciting to use some, fashion techniques as well. You can beading. There's a lot that can happen with the canvas, and I sent this slide to you because I just wanted to show you how I kind of build up the surfaces. And so the surfaces, usually I paint large color and play around. I mean, it's a very playful kind of layering process. I also use older work. So that's another hit of history again, is that I'm using my own archive as an artist, cutting that work up and reusing and layering that way. And so work evolves over time because I'm adding to it. I might show this work and then I cut it up and then I add something to it, or I might even, at some point, like cut up a work, because I'll have multiple pieces up at the same time in the studio, and cut one piece and add it to another piece, still in the same, the same body of work.
So the piece on the left there, yes, you're left. The piece on the left there is McCall,
1988.
Well,
Oh.
1922. McCall in 2021. And then this is the piece as Jackie was revising it for the show upstairs. Oh, I think this is the final piece. I don't think this is,
This is
the
the
one
final.
that I did in process in your studio. So you can see, like in 2022, 2021, where her head was at, and she was working almost entirely in that Egyptian or abstract language or that process. And then here, where she's bringing in the Mesoamerican objects and
And even I'm noticing textiles that another resident was using in their work. He had thrown all of his textiles into the trash, and I was like, "Are you kidding?" And so,
as you can see, Jackie is great at finding, just keeping scraps at all.
Oh yeah, my scrap. I have multiple scrap buckets. Yeah.
I thought that would just show one.
Yeah, just show.
But sewing is a really important process for you. And I mean, I love her sewing machine so much. It is such a good sewing machine. But also all the textile scraps and all of that. And you make your own textiles. And so one of the things you'll see upstairs is this beautiful chiffon that Jackie made with the drawings from the objects in the collection. So that's just so amazing.
Yeah, so that's my studio assistant. They helped me with some of or a lot of the beading work, because I'm okay with it, but I have a limit with it, like my patience. But Jay is very patient with. And so there was a lot of beading on these works, and these were for the BMA exhibition.
So, this is the Baltimore Museum of Art installation, and I'm sorry, my pictures are just not going to do it justice. This installation, the whole thing is just so incredible.
Thank you.
But it's so heavily hand beaded, and you can't say, you can kind of see the little black dots there, and the stunning Tiger Island that's at the entrance upstairs has some beading on the surface, so you can get an idea of what Jackie's talking about. Oh, I'm not using this mic at all.
Yeah, and they're about 11 by 11 feet, and so they're the largest works that I've made. And then this it's hard to see, but you'll see another image of it in a minute. But there is the bronze sculpture, which was a new approach. And the other thing about the large pieces at the museum, at the Baltimore Museum of Art, is that I collaborated with my dad, and he's a goldsmith, and he made medallions of my design. He made medallions that are sewn into the work, and in brass, not gold. But those medallions, some of the medallions are of this shape, and so it's a reflection of, the larger sort of black snake shape, and then also the smaller brass medallions.
And sculpture is a new thing that you're starting to move into. And so I wanted to end with this slide because it shows that three-dimensional work. And I mean, collage is inherently, it seems to be two-dimensional because it's flat on a wall often, but in fact, it is layered, and you are playing with three-dimensional space and depth. And now you're really leaning into that with the sculptural works. So can you talk Proof of Life, which is the work, and you see that printed chiffon up there in the upper right. Can you talk a bit about that? Because that's a new process for you that's leading to what I think Hillary from SoCo and I were talking earlier, how excited we are about these little shepties, which are down here in the lower left. So can you talk about how you made the Proof of Life, and then go to the shepties, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Sure. So I guess the time that I spent here and doing those drawings, and then also looking at the objects that Marie, the archaeologist, found on Tiger Island, this, I guess I just really wanted to have that, the weight of those objects. I wanted to create something three-dimensional. And even, at McCall, and with the work for the other project, I often would take my paintings off the wall and kind of like create these three-dimensional, like mounds with the painting. And so there's always been this kind of like desire to like create a three-dimensional experience, or even to work in a three-dimensional way with my hands. And I also wanted there to be this, I want there to be this thing where the work or the symbols, or it feels like things are coming off the painting, that they're like marching right off the painting and into our life. And so like the shabtis are objects, if you don't know, they're, that name, that word is attributed to these tokens or doll-like figures that pharaohs or important noble people of the ancient times would be buried with. And these doll-like figures in the afterlife would be, the servants to this important person. And so I like, I want to sort of showcase the shabti as their own, like, who cares about that pharaoh? But like, what about the shabti, and like what they carry and sort of their story and their history. So like they're, in the work, in the painting, and then they march right off the painting. Yeah, I mean, it's.
I love them so much.
Thank you.
I'm so excited because I love this whole idea of the shabti anyway. When we were talking about that, and they show up in the paintings upstairs.
Yeah.
And the idea of them being tucked into the gauze. Of
the mummified person.
Mummified.
Yeah. And the other thing with the shabti is that they're so numerous, because one person might be buried with thousands, hundreds of these things, and because they were doll-like and small, they made their way into just about every Egyptian collection.
Well, after those tombs were robbed,
right?
And
Exactly,
and the bodies disrupted, and that
totally.
Right.
I mean, in Britain, they had, in the 1800s or whatever, they had unrolling parties where they would unroll, the mummified human remains, and then the shabtis would emerge, and they were given out as party favors and things. So they're all over because of their size. They're just everywhere. And any collection that has Egyptian objects has shabti.
It's a breadcrumb of theft.
Or
Right?
yeah, that's
that.
one way to look at it. But I think of it as like the heritage dispersed, like seeds of the heritage is all
Like
over
a dandelion being blown.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And now you're making your shabtis
Yeah.
to go out in the world.
Yeah, marching right out.
Marching right out with their stories.
Yeah.
Is there anything we didn't talk about that you want to cover or say?
Did we get to all the slides? I don't know.
Before? Yeah, that's
Okay.
fun. I was going to open it up to questions.
Let's do
from
it.
the peoples. All right. Anyone have any questions? Okay.
So when we first met, you were really dealing with the Egypt heritage, and this shift that happened last year, really, towards discovering and celebrating. It's so exciting. But what's next? I mean, I see a continuation of it, but what is exciting you other than these, which are amazing? But where are you feeling like this is going, or do you know?
Yeah, I mean, not 100% sure. You know, I think the Shabtis and creating these sculptures, there's so many possibilities with this work. I mean, we were just talking, like, what happens if they're giant? You know, like, what if they're or like person-sized, or and so I feel like that there's so many possibilities and I also think that in this series I definitely step into the research of my mother's island, but there's still so much of that history. I'm sorry, that research from when I was looking at Egyptian work exclusively, like that's still in there, and so I think there's a lot of fluidity between that happens, like that's kind of a continuation.
Makes sense. The other thing I also wanted to point out in Jackie's work is that you were really influenced by visits to Cairo and the graffiti and the protest graffiti. And what always fascinates my work is that your work is that it's not all archival; it's also present day. Like there's lyrics.
Yeah,
there's
I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah.
Your son sometimes collaborates. There's music. There's slang. There's that graffiti kind of element that brings it to the present and brings in present day.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Definitely.
Your life, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, there's definitely that's the messiness, I guess, I was talking about, but there's so much information from so many different points of there's lyrics, there's like rap lyrics, there's like lyrics, rock lyrics. It's like country lyrics.
Yeah, there's Beatle, and then like the Beatles are up there, but then there's also like cowboys, Spanish speaking cowboy music, and then like
there's a lot of things.
Yeah.
And when that trip to Egypt, for example, that I did in 2020, like I said, literally you have the history on the walls, and you could have a pharaonic temple that has not mosaic, but what is it called? Frescoes, like Roman frescoes on top of that. And then that on top of that would be like a mosque is literally like built on top of that. And then there's a church, and then all of the tourist signage, and then there's McDonald's, and then, and it's like and then there's the rap music pumping out of the cars that are driving by. And so it's like this cacophony of information and history, I think, is what I'm like striving for or trying to get to.
And one of the things we were talking about when we were talking about the Sheptis, because this came up when you were going through our collection, and you found those little tiny, right?
Yeah.
These little tiny figures that were on necklaces. I think they were Aztec. And I think they were from Honduras, though, or Guatemala.
Yeah,
They might have from Guatemala. And we were talking about the similarity between all of these different cultures. Yeah. So like Egypt in ancient times and Guatemala in ancient times, and having like similar traditions. And so we think now, like, because people travel and capitalism and phones and Instagram and pictures traveling all over the world, that's how cultures are so fluid and interconnected. But in fact, like,
they've been that way for
it's been that way for all of human time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're all one. Okay. Let's see.
I am so intrigued by your medallions.
Oh, thank you.
I was just in Tibet, and I don't know if you, sorry, hi. I'm intrigued with your medallions. In Tibet, Buddhists will take their ashes and form them into metal medallion-like objects, and then place them at
With
the scroll
shrines or
at shrines
uh-huh.
in the temples, and
Wow.
they make pilgrimages to bring those. So I'm curious, just it seems beautiful that you're working with your dad on that. Is that a direction you might go, or just tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, my dad and I, we ran a business together after I graduated from undergrad. We drove each other crazy. So we did that for about 5 years, where I was doing a lot of the designing of the jewelry, and then he would do the manufacturing. And it was all fine jewelry. And my dad doesn't mess with silver. That's his but he's multi-generational goldsmith, and so to me that there was just something really potent about that, of him thinking about how to collaborate with him. That just seemed like the most natural thing to do. And I think that what's interesting is that he is someone that is very comfortable with using his hands and making these, using the old school style of making jewelry. But for these, he used a CAD program. And so he took my drawings, put them into the computer, and created CAD replications of those drawings. And so he's using, this digital form, or sort of tech form, and that to me that's awesome too. I feel like that there's just all of this deep connection and ideas that are there's so much more that can continue with that, I think. Yeah.
Were you a little disappointed that he didn't take the time to trace your drawing and no? Well, no, just because we just talked about how that
why?
exchange, or that bringing the work in when you do the drawing of it.
I mean, I love my dad a lot, but he can we drive each other crazy because we have very different ways of working, and so when I sent him the drawing and he put it into the CAD system, and he was like, "Oh, this doesn't look finished. You didn't finish this drawing right." So, he's like, "It looks messy, Jackie. It's not." And so so yeah.
So this worked out as best as it could.
Right. But I think that but I love that he did the CAD, actually, because
That's
it's an
exactly what she wanted.
yeah, but it also is just I don't know, the sort of technology end of it is unexpected.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Other questions? Can I do this?
Hey, Jackie.
Hi.
So this is the first time I'm seeing your art, and I think it's really a lot of things just resonated with me in the beginning. I think it was called La Cueva de la Sirena.
Yeah.
So my parents are from El Salvador, so I
Oh,
kind of
okay.
resonate with all of the
Yes.
oceans. But as I was looking at it, I could see sort of the Mesoamerican inspiration, but I couldn't stop thinking of Persian rugs and Persian tapestry. One of my best friends actually runs a high-end Persian rug store with his dad. And I couldn't stop getting that sort of same vibe. And then you started going into how there's a lot of inspiration of Egyptian culture into what you do. So I'm wondering if it's a balance that you have to strike, or is it sort of asymmetrical in the amount of Mesoamerican that you'll put in versus Egyptian into anything that you're working on?
It's that's a great question. But I'll address the second part of that question, is that I don't think of it that way. I don't want to think of it that way because, I spent my whole childhood, and if you are, El Salvadorian, this sort of okay, I'm part of this, I'm part of this, I'm part of that, and and the sort of like, okay, I'm 50% this, I'm 10% that, I'm 50, like, I think it's like unfair to yourself to like do that, right? And so like in the same vein, like with the work, I just let it flow. Like I let it, like I allow it to be what it is going to be. Because honestly, like I'll probably cut the work up. The gallery that I work with probably doesn't appreciate that. But there is this like, you know, the work is not precious. Like I can like, you know, it can continue to have a life, you know, in that way. Like it's like, so what isn't there now might reveal later, you know. Yeah. And then that first part of your question, it's so interesting because I have wanted to work with rug, you know, makers for a very long time. So yeah, I mean, yes, I.
Like art, like my friend breaks them down in ways that I never, kind of like you did, like the colors that they come from.
The patterns.
You see them in certain time periods. It's fascinating.
Thank you. Thanks.
It's good to see you, Jeff.
Oh,
Hi.
Hi.
This is amazing. I've been a follower of your work, but I don't think I didn't realize just how many layers are coming into it. And I was really
thanks.
struck. There will be a question, I promise. By how, you know, in some ways when you were talking about going and like being in proximity of the object and drawing from it, and it sort of reminded me in a way of when you went to museums as a child and you were looking kind of in search of that history a little bit, but then it was just presented to you in this sort of neat way when history isn't, right? It is sort of, is very messy, as you've been saying, which I love. And as you were talking about then incorporating these, you know, your drawings, whether they be from the Egyptian side or the Honduran side, and I just lost my train of thought, not my train of thought, repatriating them. It went from being sort of this personal excavation in some ways to, you know, sort of decolonizing art or art history in a way. And I wondered if the way I'm thinking about that resonates at all, like trying to even bring in this longer history of your mother's island, for instance, which the colonial cleaned up version of it is that, oh, there was no one living there when we got there, right? But that you're bringing in this longer history that's much richer and involves a lot of trade and travel of you know, these groups of people, and yeah, so just if decolonizing fits or
Yeah.
you in any way.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that yeah, it's hard not to think about that when you start looking at how, like, the history of how objects are, you know, objects of antiquity or of you know, historical value, like how they've been collected, and that, you know, the time that I spent at the British Museum was so, and also the Petrie Museum, which is a museum that's like dedicated in London, also dedicated to Egyptian antiquities, and the history of those collectors, you know, the story of those collectors, and how that like all of that, you can't not think and talk about the effects of colonialism, and it's fascinating. I mean, it's so rich. There's so much there. And it is something, you know, like with the Heba Abd al-Gawad is the woman that I connected to, who's the Egyptian Egyptologist, and that's her whole mission. I mean, she's even stopped calling herself an Egyptologist because she doesn't believe that that's a true. You're not really talking about Egypt. You're talking about an ancient time in history when you're, Egyptologists, they're not talking about the full picture of Egypt. And so her influence definitely in her stories, and she thinks of herself now as a heritage activist, advocate. And so that again, like that really is like influencing my thinking these days. Yeah.
It shows. So.
Oh, thanks.
Any other questions? Oh, yeah, sorry, Rini.
All right, you speak about the energetic and chaotic nature of your work. Do you feel that way when you're working?
That's a
And
great
how do you
question.
relax then?
Yeah, that is such a good question. I often I'm dancing in my studio. I'm making. So I got like an injury because I was dancing recently. Dance injury. Anyway, I definitely move around a lot, and because I'm, there's a physicality because of the size of the work and because I'm cutting the textiles or what have you, like whatever paper. There's something very physical about the interaction that I'm having with the work. In the scale, 11 feet, I have to get up and down on a ladder, and if I don't have my studio assistant, which it just seemed like always when they weren't there, I needing the work to come down onto the floor. It just was like always like this very silly thing because I had to get on scaffolding to pull it down. And so I think that it is even in my physical relationship to the work that there is like chaos. But I do calm down sometimes because I do, when I'm making these smaller collages, even though that there's this like element of like energetic happening with the smaller works that you see in the upstairs in the exhibition, like there's something, like you'll see very small marks in those. And even in the large works, like I get really close. So I have moments of like craziness, but then I have very meditative, like small moments as well. And the bead work too is also, I have a limit, like I said, with the bead work. But there is something very meditative about some of the work or processes. And the drawing too, the preliminary drawings. When I'm going into a museum and looking at these objects, there's something very quiet, meditative about it. That's a great question.
And I didn't know this until yesterday, but the snake, which Jackie has tattooed on her arm, is the Egyptian god of chaos. Do you want to, or symbol for chaos? Do you want to just?
Yeah,
It appears in the work. You did the bronze.
Yeah, so there's multiple meanings. It's like chaos, birth.
Watsep, is that?
Wajet.
Wajet.
Yeah, there's the sort of protector of the pharaohs or the gods or whatever. But the birth rebirth is a very important thing that's connected to the snake. And my name, Milad, I don't know if anyone speaks Arabic in this room, but Milad means birth. And so there is that also, this like idea of rebirth and chaos. I think there's a little bit of chaos within, the birth process is kind of chaotic. If you've ever been through it, it's wild. And so there's just a lot of that linkage that I really, And I told you yesterday that you may often see in Egyptian sculptures or whatever kind of Egyptian visual material, snakes with feet. And that is chaos tamed. And I thought that was, At the time when I got this tattoo, I was going through a lot of chaos in my life. This is like the word of the day. And I told my friend I'm going to get a tattoo of a snake, the symbol of chaos, and then I'm going to put legs on it so that it's like chaos tamed. And she was like, no, Jackie. It's not what you're going to do. I thought that's like, she's a good friend.
I love the idea though of like when you feel like you've settled into the chaos and you're okay with the chaos, like that's when you put the feet on. There's this, I can't remember the name of the doll, but there's a Japanese tradition where you're given a doll when you start a project, like a big life project, right? Like, I mean, I got one when I was doing my dissertation, so like that was my big life project. But there are, others. When you start your apprenticeship in Japan in craft or something, and you're given this doll, and you put one pupil on when you start the project, and as you're drawing the people in, you're supposed to meditate on like seeing yourself through the project, seeing where you want to be at the end of the project, and so on.
Amazing.
And then when you finish, when you get to the finish point that you saw in your mind, that's when you draw the other one on. It's not that it's over. It's just you've made it through this doll chapter of your project.
I love
so like that, but like
I love that. No, I love that.
yeah, maybe like 1 foot for
1
every
foot.
time you feel like you're. This was a good time.
This is just a little foot. Right.
Sorry, we digressed. Are there any other questions? Because we were going to go upstairs to the galleries and like just hang out with the work. And if anyone wants to come up and talk to Jackie individually or ask any questions in front of the pieces, she'll be there for that. What do you say? Okay, great.